Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Don. Great to be here.
So today's interview is being conducted on March 23rd, 2022, which is 1 month following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this past weekend, Russia used a hypersonic missile to strike a Ukrainian military facility. So for today's episode, we thought it would be a good idea to take a deep dive into hypersonics. And so we reached out to our good friend, Dr. Michael Griffin, who, while serving as the Pentagon's Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, made hypersonic technology his number one priority.
In today's episode, Mike talks about the history of hypersonic technology, why he made it his number one priority at the Department of Defense, and why Russia's and China's growing hypersonic capabilities represent a serious threat to American national security.
And this is Mike's second appearance on STEM Talk. He was our guest on episode 23 back in 2016 when we talked to him about his tenure as NASA administrator from April of 2005 to January of 2009. And he has a distinguished and varied career at that agency, which has included stints back in the 90s as NASA's chief engineer, and he also served as associate administrator for exploration.
Mike holds numerous academic degrees, including a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Johns Hopkins, 5 master's degrees and not in tiddlywinks, and a PhD in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Maryland. In addition to serving as NASA Administrator and Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, his long career has included numerous other academic and corporate positions. To mention just a few of his other leadership positions, Mike was President and Chief Operating Officer at In-Q-Tel, a private nonprofit enterprise funded by the CIA to identify and invest in companies developing cutting-edge technologies that serve the United States' national security interests. He also previously served as Deputy for Technology at the Strategic Defense Initiative. In 2008, Time magazine named Griffin one of the year's 100 most influential people.
And after stepping away as Defense Undersecretary for Research and Engineering 2 years ago, Mike co-founded Logic Incorporated, which is a company that provides high-end management, scientific, and technical consulting services. And today he is co-president of the company. Before we get to our interview with Mike, however, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews. As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the moniker Engineer in Massachusetts. The review is titled Super Learning. The review reads, "One of the best science and nutrition podcasts in the universe. Ken and Dawn dig deep into what makes the scientists interviewed tick, what they like to study, and why. It has changed the way I think about what goes in my body. The latest interview with Dr. Kulldorff breaks new ground in a logical discussion of COVID and the anti-science and what is real. I am glad that you could bring exposure and credibility to the Brownstone Institute doctors."
Well, thank you so much, Engineer and MA, and thank you to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who've helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to our interview with Dr. Michael Griffin.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining us today is Mike Griffin. Mike, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's been, 6 years?
Close to, yeah, absolutely. And Ken, welcome to the podcast as well.
Thank you, John.
So, Mike, we're just going to get started off. When we interviewed you back in 2016, so 6 years, we mostly talked about space exploration and your tenure at NASA as a NASA administrator. And since we last talked, you served a 2-year stint as the Pentagon's first Research and Engineering Undersecretary, which is a position that Congress created in 2018. So I'm sure that you have a unique perspective on hypersonics research and development, both here in the U.S. and also in China and in Russia.
Well, I don't know that my perspective is unique, and for the record, since a lot of it was very painful, it was 2.5 years in the Pentagon. Not that anyone was counting.
Well, each month in the Pentagon counts as about 6 months in regular life.
Exactly. Yeah, the Pentagon is not real life, even for those who are at or near the top. But the perspective on hypersonics was certainly one of the things I brought into the job as a major priority, and even more took away. So, yes.
Absolutely. And as you alluded to just now, during your time as Undersecretary, you announced that hypersonics was, in fact, your top priority. You had a list of priorities. I remember the list. Today, we would like you to give our listeners sort of a primer on hypersonic technology, a 100,000-foot primer, and explain why you made hypersonics your number one priority when you were in the Pentagon as the Undersecretary. It's sort of a brief definition, and we'll dive deeper later in the show.
I'll start off by saying, yes, when I went into the Pentagon, I did announce that hypersonics, both offense and defense, was my top priority. I mean, something has to be, and if everything is equal, then nothing is a priority. As time went on, I became more and more concerned. My then Deputy Undersecretary and I, Dr. Lisa Porter, became more and more concerned about the state of play in microelectronics. And I took to saying that microelectronics and 5G had eased their way to the top because the early priority that we gave to hypersonics started paying off. The DoD started paying attention to that, and it started moving along pretty well. But that's just background. As to why I came in with that as an early priority, it was a recognition that I had put together following my years as administrator of NASA. In the years after that, I spent a lot of time in the DoD, or national security, aerospace and defense world, more than I had in some time. I had a stint in the Pentagon back in the late 80s and early 90s, but I had not been as involved in national security work as I later became. And I became aware that the Chinese had been, and primarily and the Russians to some extent, had been taking advantage of our being bogged down in the Mideast in conflicts which were very important, but not existential for the United States. The Chinese and the Russians had been taking advantage of that time to build up their own conventional strike capability. And with hypersonics, as I'll get to in just a moment, that strike capability could be both unwarned and very high speed. So why unwarned and why very high speed? Let's take the second first. When we who are aerodynamicists, and I am one, say hypersonic, generally we mean vehicles that move through the atmosphere, usually the upper atmosphere, at greater than Mach 5, which means greater than 5 times the speed of sound. Mach 1 is defined as the speed of sound. So that's quite a high speed, about 1,700 meters per second or about 3,800 miles per hour. Obviously, that's the low end of the range, and most of the threats that we're concerned about are somewhere between Mach 5 and Mach 15, so 3 times those numbers. And that's really a frightening advantage for the offense. That implies that the Chinese can have a reach across the Western Pacific from, say, the coast of China to Guam, our farthest west outpost in the Western Pacific, with missiles that can reach Guam in under 25 minutes. That's a very frightening capability. When I say unwarned, these missiles are such that they will not show on our high-altitude geostationary orbit assets in a way that allows us to mount a defense against them, even if we had a defense, which we don't. These hypersonic missiles do leave a signature in the atmosphere, but it's relatively dim compared to what we are used to watching for intercontinental or other space launch vehicles. And so we don't see them. We need new systems to be able to see them coming, and we need new systems to be able to intercept them, and we don't have either at the present time. And that's on the defensive side. So they're unwarned. They're very high speed. We don't have a counter to them. And tellingly, we don't have a similar offensive strike capability of our own.
Absolutely. That's a nice primer. So just last week, Russia reported that they're using hypersonic weapons in the Ukraine. Much remains unclear to me about this, whether they in fact are, and more so, why. I wondered if you had any thoughts as to the why. That it would seem unnecessary in that context, in those distances. Is it possibly for strategic messaging is what came to my mind?
Well, I had several thoughts on that, and Ken, that is a great question. So the first thought is, I'm actually not sure this is the first use of hypersonic weapons. There are reports that we've had that the Russians actually used hypersonic strike in Syria a few years ago. Again, I can't verify any or all of that, and I can't verify what they did in Ukraine the other day, but indications are that, yes, they may well have employed hypersonic weapons. Why would they do that? The strike speed, again, even on shorter ranges, it's a very useful military thing to be able to press a button and within 4 or 5 minutes later, the target has disappeared. You don't need to risk an aircraft getting into combat space. And again, your adversary, your target, is essentially unwarned. They don't have time to get their people or their materiel out of the way. So we've already seen that the air defense warning systems in Ukraine are operating at full speed. People are using networks of cell phones, in fact, to warn of such attacks, and hypersonic weapons remove that possibility. Mm-hmm. You literally don't hear them coming. They arrive before the sound wave gets to you. And then, as you mentioned, Ken, I do think that there is some advantage strategically to playing one's ace, if you will. It provides a warning to other nations who might wish to intervene that the Russians have a capability that they don't have. And that's a telling message.
Yes, I think there's a substantial element of that as I pondered it. From a military point of view, I think it probably wasn't necessary, but necessary and beneficial from their point of view are two different things, as you said so well.
Regrettably true.
The media seems to have moved from COVID as their entire focus to the Russian invasion. Of course, the invasion is indeed a bad thing, in fact, relatively terrible. But you recently had an op-ed that you co-authored that reminded lawmakers and the Pentagon that we must not lose sight of the escalating threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. The piece ran in a venue called Breaking Defense. This is a digital magazine covering the strategy, politics, and technology associated with defense. Can you talk about this op-ed, which ran under the headline, Rethinking the Hypersonic Debate for Relevancy in the Pacific?
Well, I can comment on it. Lisa and I were kind of hoping that it stood on its own. I mentioned again, Dr. Lisa Porter, my former deputy undersecretary and now business partner in our consulting practice. We did author that op-ed together because in the long run, we believe that the greatest threat to the United States and the lifestyle that we hold dear and the values that are important to us and the fate of other nations in Asia and in the Western Pacific is more dependent upon what the Chinese do than on any other factor. And it is a fact that the Chinese have, over the last 20 years, built up a staggering array of offensive hypersonic capabilities. In that editorial, we mentioned the DF-21, which is essentially the equivalent of the old U.S. Pershing II capability. The slang term for the DF-21 is the carrier killer, for obvious reasons. The DF-17, a newer, longer-range hypersonic glide vehicle capable of very agile maneuvering, about a 1,300-mile range. It also has acquired the name of carrier killer, which should give us pause for thought. and the DF-26, which can range Guam and points east of Guam from well inside the Chinese mainland. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in under 25 minutes. This is a staggering array of capabilities, and it can serve only one purpose, which is to subjugate other nations, including ourselves, to Chinese will in the Western Pacific. And the U.S. should be aware of that and should rededicate itself to not allowing it to happen. We have enforced a rough Pax Americana, as some have referred to it, since the end of World War II, and the Chinese seek to displace that. The Chinese Communist Party, in particular, seeks to displace that, and we should not allow it.
You know, when you talk to people, particularly many leaders in the United States, they think of China primarily as a trading partner or as the maker of inexpensive things to buy on Amazon. And they don't really think of China as having a laser focus on the application of weapons really aimed at U.S. assets very clearly in the Western Pacific. And I think in particular the media has done a poor job on communicating this.
They have. And as a free market conservative, I would absolutely welcome any economic competition that China wants to throw at us. Let the best product win. And as long as our competition with other nations is a competition of ideas and a competition of economies, bring it on. But when nations seek to build an arsenal of weaponry that can serve only one purpose, which is to intimidate their neighbors and their putative adversaries, that sends another message entirely, and it's a message that the United States should counter in strongest possible terms. I don't want us to spend our money on an arms race any more than any other sane individual would wish to do. But it is absolutely inimical to the long-term interests of our nation and the Western democracies to allow other nations to have military capabilities that we cannot match and exceed.
Agreed.
So, Mike, a little bit later in today's interview, we'd like to circle back to your NASA days and talk about the challenges of a manned mission to Mars. And if my memory is correct, you once said, "No one wants people on Mars more than I do." So we like that quote, and we'll follow up on that in a little bit. But before we go there, we want to talk a little bit more about hypersonics and the implications for national security. So we talked about Mach 5. So to give listeners a little perspective, an aircraft flying at Mach 5, or as we talked about, just over 3,800 miles per hour, means you could travel from Los Angeles to New York in about 30 minutes. But Mach 5 represents the low end of hypersonic speeds. So as this technology continues to evolve, what do you see as the high end of hypersonic speeds?
Well, I'm glad you made that point. We defined hypersonics as starting at Mach 5, but that's not the upper bound. So Russia claims that today they have the Avangard, which is a Mach 20 plus very long range hypersonic missile. I personally don't doubt their claim. I have no special knowledge, of course, but I don't doubt the claim. The U.S. has tested now a couple of times very successfully Mach 17 rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicles with the Joint Army-Navy Conventional Prompt Strike Program. You can look this up on the web. It's publicly acknowledged information. And those weapons have demonstrated a capability of greater than 1,700 miles. That's not as much as we need, but there might be more in the bag. So the upper range is pretty formidable.
Mm-hmm. And we think of hypersonic technologies as a relatively recent development, but historically, weren't hypersonic systems first used during World War II by the Germans?
Well, that's right. The V2 reached Mach 5, or close enough to it for government work, as the expression goes, maybe just slightly under. That was part of the point of Lisa's and my editorial in Breaking Defense on the 23rd of March, which was that we're allowing terminology to get in the way of capability. Any long-range prompt strike weapon will necessarily be hypersonic. We've fallen into the trap of using hypersonic weapons as if they're a category apart, but they're not. They're well over 70 years old, and really they're making a resurgence because of the factors I mentioned about Chinese behavior in the Western Pacific and Russian behavior in Europe and it's regrettable that we need a resurgence. We should not have allowed ourselves to be so far behind.
The aerodynamic heating that occurs at hypersonic speeds is unsurprisingly very intense. The propulsion technology, the airframe materials, thermal management, all of this is very demanding, and much of it is due to this aerodynamic heating. In the mid-1950s, of course, this was an issue the Air Force had to overcome in the development of the Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile. Can you discuss the aerodynamic heating issues that one runs into at hypersonic speeds, and just a little bit about how one might handle it? And in fact, the Atlas folks handled it.
Well, there are several things that we who are trained as aerodynamicists do to handle the heating at hypersonic speeds. So let's go back to the beginning. At speeds much above Mach 5, you really do begin to encounter very high heating. And one of the characteristics of aerodynamic heating is that the intensity of the heating, if you'll forgive the geek speak, goes as the cube, roughly, maybe a little bit more, goes as the cube of the velocity. So what that means is if I double the speed, the heating is at least 8 times as intense, which is a sobering thought to those who have to handle it. So how do we handle it? Back in the 1950s, Harvey Allen and Alan Eggers of the NASA, then NACA, Ames Research Center, realized that the conventional approach of having, a needle nose on high-speed aircraft, and all one has to do is look at pictures of the F-104 and similar aircraft of that era, was the needle nose approach was not going to work. They calculated and showed the world that the so-called blunt body approach, having a rounded nose with a large nose radius, would create a standing shock wave in front of the vehicle, and most, not all, but most of the heat, much of the heat would be deflected back into the atmosphere. And that was the approach that the Atlas missile and all of our subsequent nuclear warheads have taken. It was the approach taken with the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the nose cap of the space shuttle vehicle, and it is the approach that the Orion crew vehicle will take. In addition, however, because more is needed, the technique of ablative cooling was developed and applied. So by ablative cooling, what I mean is that the heat shield for Atlas and subsequent reentry vehicles consisted of materials which would evaporate and flow away from the vehicle during its entry phase, and those heated particles that would flow away carried with them much of the heat. So you were gradually eroding the vehicle as you came in through the atmosphere. Bearing in mind that the flight times are relatively short, the vehicle only had to last for so long, and so that was an effective technique. And then finally, for the space shuttle, even for the highest temperature portions of the vehicle, the nose cap and the wing leading edges, we invented materials, broadly carbon, and silicon carbide, that could withstand that degree of heating without ablating away. They would get literally red hot, but they could withstand the temperatures, and then they would radiate the heat away later. So those were the basic techniques that were used. The vehicle shape, the materials, that's how we handled that.
As you mentioned, this was obviously an issue on return with Apollo and the others. And I've seen some remarkable speeds discussed for Apollo reentry from a lunar mission, like Mach 35, Mach 25, numbers like that. Really remarkable.
Well, that's true. For entry from Earth orbit is, by definition, a Mach 25 reentry, and entry coming back from the moon at 7 miles per second, or more is Mach 35. So that's quite a high speed.
Absolutely.
So hypersonic weapon systems fall primarily into 2 classifications: powered cruise missiles and hypersonic boost glide systems. So Mike, can you give listeners an overview of the 2 systems? And as a nation, should we invest in both? Would you say, are they complementary, or should the U.S. invest in more than one type versus the other?
Well, so to answer your last question first, they are complementary. We should be investing in both. They have different roles in our strike portfolio because of their different characteristics. So let me delve into that just a little bit. This is difficult without a picture, but I'll do my best. So a hypersonic boost glide vehicle is, as the name implies, a weapon that is boosted to high speed initially by a rocket. And we've already indicated what some of those speeds might be. In tests that the U.S. has done, a two-stage solid rocket can and has boosted the glide vehicle to Mach 17 and more. So at that speed, the vehicle exits the atmosphere and it is lobbed or thrown or coasts through near Earth space at altitudes of maybe a few hundred kilometers, well away from its target. It then does this ballistic coast through space, re-enters the atmosphere just like the Apollo or space shuttle vehicles we were discussing, and it re-enters the atmosphere and now begins to glide at very high altitudes of 60 to 80 to maybe even 100 kilometers, 40 to 60 miles or so, glides at very high altitude for a very long range, hundreds to low thousands of miles. During that glide phase, it is high enough to be above any effective air defense radar and low enough and dim enough to be not visible to our overhead missile warning assets that we might have. So it's, again, as I said some time ago, with current systems, it is essentially unwarned while it's doing this long-range glide. It also has the capability, because it is gliding, to effect substantial maneuvers. And so even when the vehicle is spotted on radar, as eventually it will be, its intended impact point will not be known or knowable because the vehicle can always maneuver again. Then as it gets close to its target, within, a few dozen miles, as it gets close to its target, it might be at an altitude of say 20 or so kilometers, something like that. It's not possible to put a definite number on it, but let's just say as it gets below 100,000 feet, it begins to head downward at a very sharp angle. So it can still maneuver in a very agile fashion. So you can envision an attacking missile corkscrewing down from 100,000 feet of altitude over your head at numbers that are Mach 5 and above until it impacts. Such a weapon could carry a warhead, of course, and ours have in tests, but it really doesn't even need a warhead. It will, at that speed impact, it will dig a hole 40 or 50 feet across or more and as deep. So you can imagine that as a precision strike weapon that will level any building that you might care to make go away. It's quite a formidable weapon. Thinking about such a weapon impacting the deck of an aircraft carrier is a scary thought. So that's the rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicle, as best I can describe it without a chart. An air-breathing cruise missile, if hypersonic, is very similar, at least in concept, to conventional subsonic missiles like the Tomahawk. It's just bigger and flies at a higher speed. That causes problems with the ingestion of air and the controlling the flow of that air to a combustion chamber and producing the combustion, which occurs at supersonic speeds, and then controlling that and pushing it out the back end of the vehicle, just like a regular jet engine. It's just that the air is so hot and moving so fast that its control and use becomes a challenge, but we are mastering that challenge. Now, when we have mastered it, the advantages of such a weapon are that you can put a lot more of them on, say, an airplane or any other vehicle than you can a rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicle, because the rocket obviously has to carry both the fuel and the oxidizer. It's independent of the atmosphere, but it weighs a lot more because of that. A supersonic or hypersonic cruise missile doesn't have to carry the air. It gets the air from outside, so it only needs to carry the fuel. So you can put more of them on any given container. A disadvantage of the hypersonic cruise missile is that it will inevitably move a lot slower than the rocket does. If we could reach speeds Mach 5 and a little bit above that, that would be quite good. So it will take longer to reach its target. It probably has to be air-launched. The air-launching vehicle will take longer to get to the point where it can release the weapon. So the timelines are different. And they're complementary for that reason, because any conflict in which we engage will not be over in the first hour. And so we will need both the high loadout that air-breathing missiles can give us, as well as the very prompt strike that rocket-boosted glide vehicles can give us. I've gone on at some length, and I'm sorry. I don't know that I could have easily made it shorter.
No, it was an excellent explanation, in my view.
Yep.
And given this explanation, how would you rate the technical challenges associated with each of these two types, looking at it purely from a technological development perspective?
That's a great question. And when we say purely from a technological perspective, we also do have to factor in money, because if we produce the perfect weapon and we can afford one of them,
Right.
That's not going to be helpful. So engineers do have to take cost into account. So the challenges for the rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicle are primarily associated with producing a thermal protection material and an aerodynamic design that can survive a long, high-speed flight within the atmosphere. As we saw for the space shuttle, that is a challenging proposition. And to do so at a cost that we can afford to replicate in the hundreds or thousands of offensive weapons is equally challenging. We absolutely know how to do it. We have demonstrated it. And of course, as I've indicated now several times, we know that the Chinese know how to do it in quantity. But we in the United States have not demonstrated the ability to do this in quantity at favorable costs. So that's the biggest challenge for rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicles. Biggest challenge for hypersonic air-breathing cruise missiles is that we really haven't completely mastered the technology of supersonic combustion ramjets. We've made a lot of progress in recent years and have had some successful tests, but we can't be said to have mastered it. When we have, the intrinsic costs of producing such rounds should be lower than trying to produce rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicles. So we think we can produce the cruise missile variants at considerably lower cost, but the challenge of the technology remains for us at this point.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
The United States has actively pursued the development of hypersonic weapons as part of its conventional global strike program since at least the early 2000s. But to be honest, in my view, not with much urgency. Partly due to your efforts and others, the Pentagon and Congress have recently shown a renewed interest in the development and deployment of hypersonic systems. I suspect this is not only due to your insights and advocacy, but also to the fact that Russia and China already have operational hypersonic systems. When do you think the U.S. might have an operational system in place, and what kind of system do you think it will be?
Well, thank you for crediting my advocacy, but I frankly think that the overwhelming increase in interest in such systems is due to the widely known now facts of the Chinese and Russian buildup of these capabilities and the fairly obvious need for the U.S. to respond. The need was obvious 15 years ago, but the United States is so often oblivious to the bad intentions of others that it is depressing. It's interesting that the United States never declares anyone else to be an adversary, and yet Russia and China for many, many years now have been declaring the United States to be their adversary. It's possible that we should actually listen to these people when they tell us they're out to get us, but that's an aside. To answer your question more directly, I think it will be several years yet. If we were to mount the kind of program that we should be mounting, it would be of order 5 years before we had substantial numbers of these weapons in our inventory. The weapons that we will have sooner rather than later in our inventory will be, again, the rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicles. We already know how to do those. The challenge is to produce them at scale and at a reasonable cost. I think it will be considerably later, certainly toward the end of this decade, before we have any reasonable quantity of hypersonic air-breathing cruise missiles.
So, Mike, given the notable advantages of hypersonic weapons, and you've discussed them in some detail, it should be obvious that not only should the U.S. develop an offensive hypersonic capability, but we will need a new type of defensive system to effectively protect against them. And you mentioned this. Could you elaborate on what some schemes or some ideas for what an effective detection and defensive system would look like?
Sure, and that is a great point. While recognizing that even the perfect defense just gets you back to even, right? You don't win with defense. Nonetheless, having a good defense complicates your adversary's strategy, as well, of course, as protecting your people and your things for a sufficient amount of time for us to take the battle forward. So defense is really important for those three reasons: complicating adversary strategies, protecting your people, and giving you time to mount your offense, because the United States is never going to attack first. So how can we defend against these things? Well, as I indicated earlier, our missile warning systems, by and large, are set up to detect the threat of intercontinental range ballistic missiles. And that's fine. That's what they were designed to do. One reason that the Chinese and Russians have developed these hypersonic capabilities is precisely because these weapons have a lower signature and are much more difficult to track. And we've talked about that. That's the unwarned capability. But that doesn't mean they're undetectable. It just means that they're not detected by systems which we have today that weren't designed to detect them. It shouldn't surprise anyone that we don't detect things we weren't designing them to detect. That was the reason that in our time in the Pentagon, the co-author of the op-ed we mentioned a little bit ago, my deputy, Lisa Porter, and I started the Space Development Agency. The director of that agency, Derek Tenure, is someone who had worked for Dr. Porter previously, and we brought him in to do this job. So what is Derek trying to do with Space Development Agency? Well, he's trying to do two things. The first is to provide a combat-resilient communications system so that the fire control data we need, which means to sense the target, relay the tracking information on that target to fire control systems, and bring what we call the shooter to bear on the target, that is a possible thing to do. Right now, our communications and our fire control systems just simply are not designed to operate at the, I'll say, level of timeliness or with the promptness that is required to deal with hypersonic weapons. So communications is job one. And of course, without actually sensing the attacker, there's no information to be communicated. So the other purpose of the Space Development Agency is to put in orbit a network of dozens to hundreds of satellites at low altitude, closer to the action, where they can see and can track these hypersonic offensive vehicles from China or Russia. So being able to see them and track them, being able to relay that information in a timely way to fire control, that is the purpose of the Space Development Agency that we created while we were there. When we have that network of low-orbiting satellites, the United States will be able, for the first time, to provide persistent, timely, global awareness of what is going on. That allows us to mount a defense. Now then, once you know that you have a target and you know where it is and you've relayed the information to fire control, you have to have a defending weapon of your own to kill the target. And in that sense, it actually looks much like an offensive weapon. With an air-breathing cruise missile, you have a good amount of time, times on the order of small numbers of hours or many tens of minutes to go after the attacker. With a rocket-boosted hypersonic glide vehicle, you have a much shorter timeline, but tellingly, you have the advantage that the HGV spends many of its minutes in its cruise phase. I described after the atmospheric entry, it cruises for a long period of time before it is overhead the target and ready to execute its terminal dive. Well, the attacker is very vulnerable during that cruise phase. It can't maneuver a lot or it won't get to its target, and it can't execute really high G maneuvers like a fighter aircraft might do in an air combat situation. It's a relatively easy target in that phase because it is fairly bright. It pretty much has to go where it's going, and the defender has a real window of opportunity to get it. So when you put all those things together in what the Department of Defense likes to call a kill chain, defense is a very real possibility. It's just that we have not built such systems yet, and we need to get on it. Again, that's a bit of a lengthy reply, and I'm sorry if it would be difficult to shorten it.
Right, and some questions require a lengthy reply, or it's not a reply at all.
Yeah,
true.
Not everything fits on a bumper sticker.
So true. Following up on your comment, is the Space Development Agency adequately funded and staffed for this task?
Space Development Agency is not yet adequately funded. They've done better more recently, but we still need more. The role of space in defending ourselves from the national security perspective is not appreciated by as many people who appreciate the value of, say, a new stealth bomber or another aircraft carrier.
Absolutely.
And so on.
In fact, I've been in discussions with folks that should know better, and when it comes around to this topic, as you say, they're much less interested than in a new fighter aircraft or something similar.
It is regrettable. And in fact, a little bit of a cost comparison, which I'll just toss out here and hope I get my arithmetic right. It may be instructive to our listeners. Everything we've talked about here has been talked about containing and deterring Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific and Eastern Asia generally. So if that's our task, if that's our existential threat in the decades ahead for the United States and the Western democracies, I'll pose the rhetorical question for us. One new aircraft carrier is going to cost us in round numbers something like $15 billion. We have a dozen or so of those, and we could certainly build one more. The United States is a rich nation. But even if we were to say that the cost of a rocket-boosted hypersonic glide weapon is at the upper end $30 million, which I think should be high enough to mount a GAO investigation if it comes to that. That's a mild attempt at humor. Even if such a weapon cost us $30 million, for the price of one aircraft carrier, you could buy 500 such weapons. So I'll ask our listeners to consider, as a non-rhetorical question, which do you think is more intimidating to the Chinese? 500 Mach 20 hypersonic weapons coming at them, or one more aircraft carrier? But our budgetary priorities seem to favor the latter rather than the former.
So, Mike, we're curious about how we fell behind in this technology. So back in the 60s, we developed an aircraft called the X-15 that flew at hypersonic speeds like dozens of times. And we were the world leader in hypersonic technology. But then it's almost as if someone pushed a pause button, and suddenly there was this lull in further development of hypersonic technology. So what happened?
Well, you bring up an interesting example. The X-15 was actually designed and built in the 1950s and modified and upgraded and flew throughout the bulk of the 60s. It flew 199 times in 11 years with one fatality. It reached Mach 6.7, the low end of the hypersonic range. It was the most amazing aircraft ever built, in my opinion, for what little that might be worth. As you say, we kind of hit the pause button because once we had strategic dominance, and by strategic dominance, I mean more and better intercontinental missiles and nukes than Russia. I don't know. I guess remembering back to that time, I think we sort of decided we had enough. No one else was developing hypersonic weaponry. It was all about ICBMs and nukes, and we were done. And then, 20 years later, we had won the Cold War, at least round one of the Cold War, we seem to be starting back. And again, there didn't seem to be any need for more weaponry. And one more time, the United States never thinks anyone else is the adversary. Regrettably, the adversaries get a vote on that. So we just didn't see that there was a military need for it. On the flip side, there's just not yet, at the level of technology that human beings can presently bring to bear, there just is not an economic argument in favor of hypersonic air transport. So the other engine of advanced development, of course, is always greed, economics, and that didn't work out. So there wasn't an imperative to develop hypersonic technology after the research work that was done in the 50s and 60s.
So the bedrock of military thinking during the nuclear age has been the psychology of mutually assured destruction. But hypersonic missiles compress that time that a military will have to take defensive steps or even retaliate. So do you think we're entering an era where the pressure to strike first is greater than ever?
No, I don't. I think we should avoid conflating mutually assured destruction, i.e. nukes, with hypersonic capability. So let me say at the outset, any long-range weapon big enough to fly itself to a target and carry any kind of a warhead is in fact also big enough to carry a nuke. The nukes are small enough that, again, anything big enough to move itself can also carry a nuclear warhead. But we have, as you just said, we have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can do that job, and I don't know that we need to do it two different ways. The unappreciated, or certainly underappreciated, genius of what the Chinese in particular have done with hypersonic weaponry is they have developed intermediate range capability out to 2,500 miles and beyond. They've developed intermediate range capability, which, yes, it can carry a nuke, okay, but I doubt the Chinese want to start a nuclear war. They want to control the world. They don't want to destroy it. So it can carry a nuke, but the genius of their approach is that it is a tactical conventional round, which can threaten Guam, which can keep our carriers east of Guam. They have developed a tactical conventional approach which blunts the tactics that the United States has used for now approaching 80 years to project power. How does the United States project power? We build military bases on land that either we own and control, or upon which we have allies who will allow us to build bases there that allow us to project air power from those bases to regions that might be contested. The other way that we project power is we send aircraft carriers to within range of potential conflict zones and launch aircraft and project power from there. That's how we do it. The Chinese have noticed that. So they have developed conventional systems which have the capability to threaten those very high-value assets that we have, air bases and aircraft carriers, and nullify them without having to go nuclear. So without having to go nuclear, they've developed systems which have a strategic impact. Why do I say strategic impact? I would ask our listeners to think about what happens to the United States in its role as the global superpower and the only nation which seeks to enforce peace rather than conflict. What happens to the strategic role of the United States in the world when we can't get closer than 2,500 miles to zones of likely conflict in the Western Pacific? I would submit that we have ceded our role as a global superpower to China in such a circumstance. I don't think that that's good for Western democracies in general, or for the United States in particular. I'm sorry. I'm an unabashed patriot and believer in the fact that for whatever faults we may have, the United States is still the greatest force for peace and freedom in the world today. And I am opposed to ceding control of vast stretches of the earth to autocracies such as the Chinese Communist Party or to Putin's Russia.
Mike, so unlike the previous leaps in military technology, such as the creation of chemical and biological weapons and ballistic missiles with multiple nuclear warheads, these developments ignited international debate and eventually led to the superpowers negotiating treaties. So do you see Washington, Moscow, and Beijing having any serious discussions today about the development or deployment of hypersonic technology?
No. Those weapons all have in common the fact that while they're very effective, they paint with a very broad brush. And really, no one wants to use them for those reasons. I mean, we would, to defend ourselves after a first strike, we would employ nuclear weapons. The United States will not employ chemical or biological weapons. Others may, others have. But they are indiscriminate. They are destructive. And the attacking nation may gain its goals with those weapons, but there is an enormous amount of collateral damage. So they're not something that you can use in any sort of a graduated way. Hypersonic weapons, combined with the precision guidance capability that has been developed over the last several decades, offer pinpoint precision to the attacker. You can take out a building in 20 minutes that contains the chief executive of an adversary nation, to put a fine point on it. You can remove a particular munitions dump without even impacting the rest of the base. In a darker scenario, we all read from international newspapers reports last summer and fall that the Chinese had tested 2 fractional orbit bombardment systems carrying hypersonic missiles that go part of the way all around the Earth and then re-enter and hit a target with pinpoint precision. So all of the radar warning assets that the United States possesses are basically pointed, west or east or north, because that's where attacks from ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles could reasonably come. So I'll ask you, what would be the impact on the United States if the Chinese sent, say, 50 fractional orbit systems into orbit coming up to the United States from the south, where we're not even looking, and they hit, say, 50 power plants in the United States? They would just hit those power plants. There would be minimal civilian casualties and actually no necessary reduction in our military capabilities. But the United States would be, and we could recover from that in time, but for an indefinite period of time, the United States would be on its back if the 50 largest power plants in the United States were taken out.
It would be quite a long time, because those transformers the big transformers are made in Germany and way back order.
That's exactly right. And then there are many other factors as well. Right. So the United States would be a nation largely without any sort of civilian power capability. Food deliveries would stop. All capabilities that we now know would come to a halt. The United States would be utterly unable to engage in any form of military power projection and would have to retire from any conflict. The strategic implications of pinpoint conventional strike, in my view, actually overwhelm the far less likely to be used strategic implications of nuclear dominance. Now, that is not to suggest that we should forego our nuclear strike capability. We have to have that to counter the crazed adversary who decides to attack us and wipe us out. But the pinpoint strike capability of hypersonic systems is far more likely to be used in a real-world conflict, in my view.
So I recently listened to an interview with our friend Dr. Mark Lewis, and we've both enjoyed various kinds of interactions with him over the years. And in that interview, Mark and Dr. Dick Hallian remarked that the Russians, and particularly the Chinese, are indeed well ahead of us in hypersonic technology, at least partly because, in their view, they benefited substantially by the research, the reports, and the sort of public discussions of papers produced by NASA and the Air Force, as well as some things that weren't public that they were able to get a hold of. He went on to say that the Chinese have learned to do things that we used to do, and in some cases are now doing them better than us. Have you also observed this?
Yes, absolutely. Everything that Dick and Mark said was completely true.
Yes. In my own field, which is clearly not hypersonics, the Chinese often take results from our funded research, our federally funded research, and apply it much more quickly than we do if we apply it at all.
Well, we don't feel threatened. And unless we feel threatened, we're not going to be implementing at scale the discoveries we've made. I personally, this calls for a conclusion of the witness, but I'm here. So I personally am not worried about the fact that the Chinese or other nations are trying to gain ground from development work that we do. That is what I would prefer to see. I will really worry when the Chinese aren't trying to glean results from our work because we're no longer ahead and they no longer care. The winner, if you're running a race, the winner is looking at the tape and all the other guys behind him are looking at the winner. And, the winner isn't looking behind him.
The problem with Mark's story isn't that the Chinese are looking at what we do. It's that we're often not looking at it. So, we admire the problem and study it for 50 years, and we don't build things and we don't test things and do it at scale.
That's exactly right. We act as if we don't have people in the world who are out to get us, and yet we do have people in the world who are out to get us, and we should pay more attention to that and act accordingly.
In addition to the Russians and the Chinese, are there other nations with active advanced hypersonic development programs?
Well, that's a great question because we have seen recently that the North Koreans have begun to mount a significant hypersonic capability. You mentioned the op-ed that Lisa Porter and I authored was published in Breaking Defense on the 23rd of March. Well, several months ago, Breaking Defense also published an analysis of the North Korean hypersonics test and concluded that it was very real and very capable. And the mathematical analysis furnished by the authors of that opinion paper was quite well done. So those who follow these developments in the various news media, I think, are well aware that it isn't just China and Russia. We have other adversaries following on. I seriously doubt that it will be very long before other rogue nations such as Iran seek to develop such capability. The precision strike capabilities, the unwarned aspects, and the very significant promptness with which hypersonic strikes can be executed are tempting properties for any adversary.
Absolutely. So, Mike, do you think our universities are producing the engineering brainpower we need to compete with the Chinese and the Russians at sufficient volume and scale? Enough people, enough really good people. I understand the Department of Defense is spending $20 million a year to encourage universities across the country in a particular program to focus on DoD-specific problems. What should that number be, in your opinion, if you have an opinion on that? Are we spending it efficiently and correctly? For example, perhaps less grants and more training programs, or how would you see the benefit associated with this?
Well, I can't pick a number because the number is a consequence, not a postulate. Our goal should be to continue to be the world's most advanced society ever. And to do that, we need to be developing and training the best people ever. And so that's a research and development pipeline that goes right from basic science, basic feasibility, on through engineering development, test, and finally application at scale. And if the United States is serious about maintaining its primacy in the world, we will fund such programs and such developments, whether it's through DoD or any other agency. I personally am a product of the scholarships and the money that went into science and math and engineering in the post-Sputnik world, when we felt really threatened by Russian capabilities, Soviet capabilities in space. The United States lived, I would say, for several decades off of the priorities that were provided for science, math, and engineering in that era because we thought it was important. More recently, we have we have been resting on our laurels, and we're not implementing the kinds of programs that would attract our best and brightest to continue those advancements. I mean, when our best and brightest go into the capital markets instead of into science and engineering, that says something.
Mm-hmm. Or they spend their time working to invent the like button and other such important tasks.
Exactly.
Well, Mike, let's talk about something that's a little bit more positive than an arms race. NASA's Perseverance rover, which landed on Mars a year ago. So NASA has described the landing as a pivotal moment for the United States in space exploration. Would you agree about that?
Well, sure. It's one of many pivotal moments. It was a stunning accomplishment. It's good to be able to repeat a success. I'll point out that Mars Curiosity, which landed back, I think, in 2012, was the first time that was done, and therefore maybe even more impressive and more pivotal. But I'm not going to disrespect any landing on Mars. It's a hard thing to do every time.
Very much so. And I remember when Jack Schmidt and I were briefed on the plans for the entry, descent, and landing system that they had came up with. I wasn't sure it wasn't an April Fool's joke. It was so unlikely and so complicated. And I'm amazed and proud of the people that have made that work.
Well, in his book on Mars, the Mars Curiosity mission, Rob Manning, the chief engineer at Jet Propulsion Lab, recounts the story of the meeting at NASA headquarters where I had to decide whether they would or would not go forward with that approach. Because I as administrator at that time, I was very cognizant of the fact that with a mission at the public scale and expense that a landing like that on Mars would be, that really I was betting the agency on its success. If it failed, the congressional investigations that would follow would be awesome to behold as to how we would ever approve such a thing. So Rob, in his book, points out that after making them brief all the technical details of how they intended to accomplish that landing, I told them in rough terms that I can't find a reason why it would fail. So, okay, you're approved. Go ahead. It was
a gutsy move.
Funny. Well, Adam Stelzner, in particular, the kind of inventor of that approach and the guy who prosecuted it, and the team surrounding them at JPL, they did. They had a very gutsy approach, and it has turned out to work quite well.
Mm-hmm. And it solves an otherwise very difficult problem.
Exactly. It's landing on Mars is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
With anything that size, it was very impressive.
Well, as we often say, you have enough atmosphere to get in the way, but not enough atmosphere to help you.
Right.
It's a lot easier to land on the moon than it is to land on Mars.
Absolutely. And speaking of Mars, for a long time, you've been an advocate for the human exploration of Mars, and you're a proponent of what you might call a measured approach to sending humans to Mars by first returning to the moon, which NASA is currently planning to do with its Artemis mission. And the goal of Artemis, the stated goal, is not only to put humans back on the moon, but then to build a long-term human presence on the moon. Please discuss this strategy, that is the measured approach, first the moon, long-term presence on the moon, and then Mars. And whether you think there is really any chance of it happening.
Well, I am a proponent of the United States leading the way to Mars, putting people there, and as you say, of a measured approach, quote unquote. What I really want in large is I want the United States to be the world's leading spacefaring nation. I want the United States to be at the frontier, pioneering that frontier in a way that is absolutely second to none. And if other nations wish to join us, then I think that's wonderful. But there should be no doubt that the United States is first among equals in pioneering any new frontier. So then you have to say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that you go the places you can go. And with the technology of our times, the places that we can envision going within the next decades are the moon and Mars. That's what we can do. Now, I've often said that in the year 3000, I expect that there will be more economic activity in the solar system than there is on Earth, but that's a long time. What we can do today is we can think about the moon and Mars, and in that order, in my view. So the goal of returning to the moon to stay, to build up our capabilities there, the goal of carrying out the first explorations of Mars, I could not support them more strongly. The second part of your question is, what's the likelihood that we're going to do this? With the current Artemis program and the program architecture, I would say it's minimal likelihood.
That's my view, too.
It is not an approach which has a high probability of success, in my view.
And every 4 years, we tend to start all over again, or at the best, every 8 years.
Well, we do, and we seem to want to be clever about things which don't need cleverness. The current approach to Artemis is to use, a very odd staging point in an orbit which varies between 3,000 miles above the moon and 70,000 miles away from the moon as a staging area to land on the moon. And I frankly don't see the point. It introduces delays, it introduces risks, it introduces delta V expenditure that don't help us land on the moon and stay there. And until we have a more sensible basic architecture, I don't think there's much chance of long-term success.
Well, we had one some time back.
We know how to get to the moon, and we know what we need to do. It would be heartwarming, in my opinion, for the United States to understand again its role in the world and the value of pioneering the space frontier to buttress that role in the world. If I sound like a committed supporter of the United States, in particular, in Western democracy in general, then that would be the correct view. One of my political adversaries once labeled me in public as a, quote, unreconstructed Cold Warrior, unquote. And I took that as a compliment rather than the criticism as it was intended.
Yeah, amazing that would be a criticism.
So, Mike, as you well know, not everybody in this country thinks that space exploration should be a national priority. In your mind, why should it be a priority?
Well, I think space exploration should be a priority because it is one of the frontiers of our time, and a great nation not only does not shrink from the frontiers of its time, but pioneers those frontiers. In the long run, if we are not the leaders on the space frontier, then other nations will, and the rules and the values that are conveyed to that frontier will be conveyed by the people who show up, not by the people who stay home and watch it on TV. And I believe that, again, despite our flaws, that the values of Western democracies and freedom and individualism are the values that we want to carry forward to the human frontier, wherever that is. And I don't think any lesser reason would suffice, really, and I don't have a more important one. So that's where I stand.
I think that's an excellent response. So in an interview that you gave not too long ago, you talked about how the U.S. partnership in space with Russia and other European nations was a good thing, and the Russians have played an important role in the operation of the International Space Station. However, recently the joint European-Russian mission to Mars, called ExoMars, was suspended because of the conflict in Ukraine. So what are your thoughts about the likelihood of the U.S. working together with Russia again on space missions?
Well, it depends on the time frame. I think in the longer run, we will resume our cooperation with Russia, and I hope we do. The enemy of the United States is not the Russian people. I made many Russian acquaintances during my time at NASA, and I frankly liked them. The enemy of the United States is not the Chinese people. It is the Chinese Communist Party. The enemy of the United States is not the Russian people. It is Putin and his coterie of like-minded thinkers. In the long run, if the United States and the Western democracies stay strong, those people will pass from the scene and more enduring values will, I believe, obtain. The United States should always be willing to cooperate with people who want to cooperate, while at the same time making it quite clear what the consequences are for not cooperative behavior, but adversarial behavior. It has never been put better than what Theodore Roosevelt said with the walk softly but carry a big stick analogy. There's no need for the United States to throw its weight around in as long as other people are behaving, but we should make it quite clear that severe consequences can be administered to those who behave badly. And if that sounds arrogant, I'm sorry, but in a competitive, adversarial, dangerous world, there will always be people who seek power over others. Our culture is inherently peace-loving. We don't declare other people to be adversaries. We don't seek out fights, but it should be very clear to all that if they wish to engage in one, the United States is prepared and able to stop it.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. And we know that you are really busy, as always. After you left the Department of Defense, you co-founded a company called Logic Incorporated, which is LogiQ. And this provides high-end management, scientific, and consulting services. So how's the new company doing?
Well, my former associate administrator at NASA and my former deputy at the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Dr. Porter, whom I've mentioned elsewhere in this, and I decided to set up our own consulting practice. It has gone very well. It's been quite rewarding. We've been in more demand than I frankly thought we would be, and that's been a happy circumstance. And being back in the private sector is rewarding in itself. I've spent a good deal of my career in public service, and it has its rewards, but it is grinding. When one is in private practice, as we are, we take on only those clients we like and enjoy, that we believe to be ethical, all those good things. And generally, we find that when people are paying for our advice and counsel, they're more likely to take it than when we were in public service and basically giving it away for free.
Well, Mike, thank you again so much for joining us today. And we always love chatting with you. Today, we talked about Ukraine, hypersonics, and future space exploration. It's always fascinating to talk to you. So thank you again for joining us on STEM Talk.
You're very welcome. I hope to do it again sometime. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, Mike. It was great.
Thanks, Ken.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So, Ken, it's a little unnerving to think about this hypersonics arms race that we are in with Russia and China, and it's hard enough to watch what's going on in Ukraine. But Mike today really helped me better understand not only hypersonics, but also the stakes that are involved in the development of these missiles and other technology.
You're right, Don. However, it's even more unnerving to learn that we really don't have any adequate means of defending against these weapons. I know Mike got some pushback when he made hypersonics his number one priority as Undersecretary. But after listening to him talk today, I hope our listeners will understand not only why he did it, but also be very glad that he did do it. That said, thus far, our national leadership remains, in my view, insufficiently focused on this challenge and is worried about all kinds of lesser threats.
So if you enjoyed this interview as much as Ken and I did, we invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. And just to note, this is all lowercase, no hyphen in STEM Talk, all one word. This is Don Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.